Thank you. Senator Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome.
Good
Ambassador,
afternoon.
good to be with you. Last month, Senator Rose and I introduced the Ukraine Human Rights Policy Act. This would, among other things, establish a process for Congress to nominate individuals for human rights sanctions through CATSA. Through this legislation, it's our hope and fervent belief that we can ensure the U.S. has the authority to respond to the Russian government's atrocities and continue to uphold our commitment to stand with the Ukrainians in their fight for democracy as well as their own humanity. Can you describe our government's current processes for selecting both on-the-ground perpetrators and senior officials for targeted sanctions for human rights violations, and tell me to what extent the process is working or not working?
Indeed. Thank you, Senator, for that question. We have a sanctions coordinator now within the United States State Department, which is very helpful, working with Treasury and Commerce to coordinate the whole range of sanctions that do exist. I know that we have deployed them very robustly in the Russia context. More than 7,000 individuals, for example, has been subject to travel bans under 7031C. We have a number of dozens of individuals who've been subjected to individual sanctions. We have the Wagner Group, of course, also subject to sanctions. So the key, of course, is to have designation packages. We need to know the individual's name, but we also often need to know some biometrics in order to be able to tell banks around the world to freeze assets if they happen to have them. It's not enough to say there's a grainy photograph of some dude in Bucha, right, that we want to sanction. We need to have information. And so to the extent that we can continue to collect that information from all available sources, the Ukrainians are very keen to assist us in this regard. They want to see these sanctions authorities exercised to the maximum extent possible as well, but also civil society actors who often have unique sources of information. And my office is funding a number of these civil society organizations that want to feed into these sanctions packages.
So if this legislation were to pass and Congress were empowered to nominate individuals for human rights sanctions through CATSA, how would the interaction between your office and the sanctions coordinator have to change?
I don't know that it would. I'd have to look at the legislation. I apologize. I haven't seen the draft text. I'm happy to take that back and give it a close read. We work quite closely with them. It's really their job, though, so we are often more in a support role. If we come across names that we think are appropriate in any situation in which we know we have a sanctioned authority, we will help them. We often are also quite encouraging of them to make sure that our sanctions parallel justice processes that are happening around the world, including at the ICC. So if we have a sanctions authority, we should be sanctioning individuals who are also being prosecuted by the ICC, right? They have reasonable grounds to believe they've committed atrocity crimes. So we'd be keen to be of assistance in that regard.
That's fantastic. We'll follow up with the draft
Please do.
legislation,
Thank you.
and if you have any technical feedback, I'd welcome that. We'd all agree that people who commit war crimes and crimes against humanity have to be held criminally accountable, though it remains an open question as to how this can best be accomplished. How do you assess the likelihood of any sort of accountability for Russia's atrocities in Ukraine? Is it likely to be confined to those who are plucked off of the battlefield, or is there a way that we can ensure it's broader in scope as we look, God willing, to a day in which the conflict ceases?
My hope is that the various pathways to justice that exist will be ready, prepared to move forward the minute there's a target of opportunity. But you've put your finger on the real challenge, which is custody over the accused. There are individuals in Ukrainian custody, and those cases have been able to proceed. They also have the ability to proceed in absentia. We don't in our courts, and many courts do, many courts don't, depending on their national legal framework. Those cases, though, in absentia are sometimes unsatisfying, as you can imagine. You want to see that defendant in the dock having to answer to those particular charges. So this is a long game, though, those of us in this work. In fact, just today, the Yugoslavia Tribunal issued its final judgment, now decades after the war in the former Yugoslavia. And then, likewise, last week, one of the few final Rwandan genocidaires was captured in South Africa and now will be brought to justice. So we have to think about this in terms of generations, not in terms of the next year. So my goal is to collect evidence, preserve that evidence, strengthen the systems so that the foundation is laid for when we do get that individual who chooses to travel, who gets tossed out of Russia, whatever the circumstances, fall into custody. We are ready, evidence is available, charges can be pressed, and that case can move forward.
you've just anticipated sort of my next line of questioning, because I wouldn't expect, we certainly cannot bank on the Russian government, however constituted, once violence has ceased, to cooperate and send their own nationals to us, though a variety of carrots and sticks can be brought to bear. How should our bilateral diplomatic behaviors towards Russia change until Russia were to comply with international criminal justice efforts?
Yes, I mean, we are all hopeful, I think, for a political transformation within Russia. And the hope is that the Russian people and that others in leadership positions recognize the terrible disaster that this has been for Russia, militarily, but also in terms of their just standing on the international stage. They're an international pariah. Their assets are frozen around the world. You know, they can't travel. Many of them will not be able to travel. You're hearing, you know, all sorts of limitations that have been placed upon Russia and Russian figures because of the terrible decision to invade Ukraine. So we need to, I think, strengthen relationships, as we have tried to do always, with moderates, with reformers, with those democratic champions, with civil society actors that stand ready to try and build a genuine civil society movement within Russia. But we, you know, there's only so much one can do while Putin remains in power.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Good afternoon.